About 12 days ago, I made a video talking about the conflict in the Middle East and how, if that escalates, we might see some consequences here in the UK by way of oil prices, inflation, and therefore interest rates. Over the past kind of like week or so, we started to see oil prices increase. And I want to talk about that in this video. And look, straight off the bat, I'm not saying that we're going to get to where we were, where oil price was $122 a barrel. And that really facilitated the increase in energy cost here in the UK, us heating our homes. I'm not saying that we're going to get to that point. But when we start to see the conflict escalate in the Middle East and oil prices react accordingly, we have to pay attention to this and pay attention to it because the Bank of England are paying attention to this as well. And I'm going to read you a quote from Andrew Bailey a little bit later on. So the question here is this a risk to the UK? I think there is a risk to the UK here from an inflation point of view, and inflation is going to hit your pocket personally. Now, looking at the live crude and Brent oil numbers right now, crude is at $73 a barrel. Brent is at $77 a barrel. Brent has gone up this month 6.49%. Crude has gone up 5.59% this past month. So it's on a rise, it feels, from where it was previously just a couple of weeks ago. So what does this mean for us specifically? Now, I think it's really important to acknowledge, and I said this in one of the other videos that I made, what we're talking about here is the impact of a conflict in the Middle East, a conflict in which people are losing lives. And it's a luxury for us to talk about how it's going to impact our household, our personal finances in the comfort of peace. So I want to be sensitive to that, right? But Israel is going hell for leather at the moment, really trying to hammer home its agenda around the fact that it's still got stuff going on in Gaza. It's still literally invading Lebanon right now. Obviously, Iran reacted as a result of that. So they're now talking about what options do they have to retaliate against Iran for the missiles that they sent in. One of the options they're looking at is potentially targeting their oil production facilities. Now, Iran is the 7th largest oil exporter on the planet, the 7th. So maybe not one of the big boys like Saudi Arabia, for example, but the 7th. Now, there is an interesting piece in an article here, which basically says Iran is the world's 7th largest oil exporter, with half of its exports going to China. If supplies were disrupted, China could turn to Russia. This talks about this is, BRICS and that alliance right there. They're all in that alliance pretty much, right? So whilst Iran might have its facilities targeted, China's not going to be impacted. The US isn't going to be impacted. China can go to Russia. The US, to a certain extent, can produce and go to other markets if it needs to. Us in the UK, though, we can't necessarily do the same. So we are very heavily dependent on the whole wholesale market in terms of getting our energy, getting our fuel. And the reality is that no matter which way you look at it, if there is any movement in global oil prices, is going to impact the cost of importing food into the country, transporting that food to the shops so that you can get it into your fridge, is going to impact the cost of you filling up your car on a weekly basis. And as you know, these companies are not going to carry that additional cost on their balance sheet. They're going to pass it on to consumers, to you and I. So therefore, the people that are going to have to carry the brunt of any disruption and price increases is you and I. We have to bear that brunt. And that in itself is inflationary. Now, one of the big things that has been muted here is that, okay, so what happens if we were to lose Iran's oil supply globally? Who can pick up the slack? And this is where Saudi Arabia comes in. And this is another snippet from this article. It says, there is more than enough capacity globally to cover the gap if Iranian production is lost. But there is the question of where Saudi Arabia's loyalty will lie as the world's second largest oil producer, and whether it will increase or restrict further production. And that in itself is going to be a big question, as you know. Saudi Arabia is part of BRICS. Saudi Arabia, Russia, closely aligned in that regard in terms of that relationship as a whole. Now, what Saudi Arabia could do is they could say, well, actually, you know what, we'll pick up the slack. If, Iran are not pumping out, 1 million barrels a day, we'll pick up the slack and fill that gap. But they could also say, well, actually, you know what, we would rather restrict supply, reduce our supply. So not only would there be 1 million barrels a day lost from Iran, but we'll restrict supply, because they could do this, and they have done this in the past. That would drive up oil prices. And that would impact us negatively here in the UK. Now, this is what Andrew Bailey has been saying about all of this, just to bring this back to monetary policy here. So Andrew Bailey, Governor of the Bank of England, which sets interest rates, has warned the conflict in the Middle East has the potential to be a very serious impact, to have a very serious impact on the UK. Mr. Bailey said he is watching developments extremely closely. This comes as he signaled interest rates are on the path downwards, and the UK's prospect on inflation, which has come down after being driven up by high oil and gas prices in 2022, are looking brighter. So this is Andrew Bailey, closely monitoring it. Now, as I've already talked about the fact that if it costs more to get your food to the shop and more for you to get it from the shop into your fridge, and it costs more to put oil or gas in your car, obviously from a business point of view, that's going to be passed on, and that in itself is inflationary. And so this is where it comes full circle. This is a big risk. This escalation is a big risk to UK inflation and your pocket. Because if we do get to the point where oil prices get to $100 a barrel, $120 a barrel, which is the peak that we had in 2022, right? What happened to the inflation picture here in the UK? That at the moment is, I don't necessarily know the answer to, but we're having this conversation because I think that is something that maybe we should be aware to monitor. Whether we're going to be able to do anything about it, I don't know. One thing I will say is leadership from America at this point in time feels like it's very, very weak in relation to the path that Israel is going down in the Middle East. And look, Israel is a sovereign country, so America can't tell them what to do, but they are also allies. And I can't help but think it is a bit of a hypocritical position to be in, where if Israel was not allies with the Americans would apply more pressure for them to not escalate this in the Middle East. It feels like it is feeding into certain agendas, which is why they're saying, de-escalate, but Israel's pushing on, and there are no consequences at all for Israel in this regard. And so, look, it's going to be a very, very interesting story to follow. And I say interesting, bearing in mind everything I said at the beginning of this, and the fact that people are dying in the conflict, and people dying in the conflict is not interesting. But you get what I mean. I would love to know what your thoughts are on this entire thing. There is a silver lining. According to sources, we aren't necessarily getting all of our oil from, that side of the world at this point in time. Norway is a huge supplier of ours at the moment. To what degree, I don't know. Are we getting 100%, 50%? I don't know. what percentage or what proportion of our energy we're getting from Norway. But what I will say is we are susceptible to global market prices. That's going to be the interesting piece, and one that is definitely worthwhile monitoring moving forward. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. I appreciate you for watching this. I'll catch you later on. Cheers.